Thank you so much for joining us, Chris. I would love for you to take a second to introduce yourself, telling us who you are and what Trust Insights does.
Sure. My name is Christopher Penn. I'm the co-founder, chief data scientist of Trust Insights.ai. My role at the company is to push all the buttons. We're a management consulting firm. We specialize in analytics and AI. And what we do is help companies make use of their data, make use of their technology, make use of their MarTech stack, and increasingly make use of different generative AI platforms and strategies to get past the shiny object factor and get to actually using this stuff in productive ways that are useful. So that's the nutshell of what we do.
Can you talk us a little bit through the trajectory of your career and how you kind of did this on-ramp to data science and this cross-section of data science, generative AI, and marketing?
Sure. So I'm an IT guy by origins. So I started out in IT. In fact, my master's degree is in information systems. And then in the early 2000s, I went to work at a financial services startup. And that was the decade when IT became marketing. So update the web server became update the website. Administer send mail on a Linux server became send the email newsletter. And the field of marketing technology came out of that decade. It's so weird to say that now, like that decade in the before times. And then during that decade, in 2005, something really important happened. Google purchased a company called Urchin. And Urchin was an extremely expensive on-premise server solution that did web analytics. And Google bought it and then gave it away for free as a tool called Google Analytics. This is, by the way, if you ever see when you're doing your own web analytics, see a UTM go, like UTM source, a UTM, that stands for Urchin Tracking Module. That is how old that is. That's the legacy of that little term. Yeah, people are like, why does it mean UTM? Well, it's because it was Urchin originally. And it sort of became the web standard. So that became sort of the informal start of my analytics career. And then when I left that firm and joined an email marketing company in 2010, we really doubled down on measurement, on how do we measure this stuff. And it was around then, it was August 2012, when Google came out with its first multi-touch attribution models. And that was when we all started going, maybe there's more to this stuff than just, everyone had been using last touch up until that point. And that was when I started getting really into the data science side of things to say, okay, well, what else is there? Because I don't necessarily agree with, the out-of-the-box model. And I started digging into the programming language R, started teaching myself that. Around 2013 is when I joined my former agency to build a marketing technology practice that incorporated data science. We parted ways in 2017, 2018 when they wanted to go in one direction. And the writing was on the wall for where AI was going. 2017 was the year the Transformers model was released by Google DeepMind. And that was the beginning of generative AI. I started playing with it in 2020 when GPT-2 was made available and people could download, install it, and run it and stuff. And that was when we all started going, this stuff is actually pretty capable. I mean, it was nothing compared to what you can do today. It had no reasoning capabilities. It was just a word prediction machine. But GPT-2 and then GPT-J6B from Eleuthera Research were the first models where it's like, okay, this can actually write coherently, right? It may not be ever factually correct, but at least it's not, like your cat walking across your keyboard. It was coherent. And we founded the company on predictive analytics and data science and what we now call classical machine learning, or classical AI, regression analysis. Your average marketer knows this as attribution analysis, right? Or uplift modeling. Those are things that are classical AI. And then, of course, November 2022 rolls around and ChatGPT comes out and suddenly everyone's an AI expert.
The fact that you were there for the origins, right? You've been there from the beginning gives you a very unique point of view compared to the overnight ChatGPT gurus. You said that you really wanted to lean into data science. Is there kind of a through line back before even your professional life that you think thematically would have drawn you toward data science in this realm of generative AI?
All of this stuff comes from being a nerdy kid and getting bullied a lot, right? And understanding the importance of data. We will go back, dial the clock back to 5th grade in a time before computers, at least before computers were widely available. We had a computer lab back then filled with like Apple II Plus and Apple IIe computers. But One of the things that I discovered is that people understand the value of information and the value of data when it applies to them. So one of the things that I did way back then to avoid getting bullied at school was back then, and this is going to be hard to believe for people under 30, people would pass notes in class written on folded up pieces of paper that would be handed from one person to another. Our school kept all of the locker combinations for the whole school's lockers on one 3.5-inch floppy disk in the computer lab that no one ever thought to guard because who would want that? I, at recess one day, made a copy of that file, got the students' names, locker numbers, and locker combinations. And then at recess, I would go through their lockers, take the notes they've been passing in class, photocopy them, put them back in their lockers. And I had a database of what was going on at that school, who was interested in who, et cetera. And so when people who were interested in bullying would approach me, I'd say, so what would you like to know about what Kelly thinks of you? And I became an information broker on the playground. This saved me from getting stuffed into lockers and beaten up, which was very nice. And so that through line continued through my adult life of understanding that data is important when you use it properly, when you bring it to life, when people see this is what it means to me. Back then, this cute girl was interested in me, or this guy really thinks I'm an idiot, or whatever. Now it's at a corporate level, you have all this data, you have all these systems. What does it mean, and what can you do with it?
I love that you just gave us a deep cut from the 90s.
80s. This is the
80s.
80s.
80s. Yeah.
Plastic
We're not
pants and
gonna
big
admit
hair.
that. But I think that also demonstrates the marketer in you too, right? You know your audience and you know what information is valuable to them and you know how to create a transaction. You gated that information, did you not?
Exactly. And I had it all memorized and cataloged. And I'm sure there's probably a crate somewhere in my parents' house with all the original paperwork.
You had little personas for, this information
Exactly.
would be good for the bully.
Exactly.
So talk to me about the origin story of Trust Insights. What was the problem that you were really seeking to solve when you created your company?
So the PR firm that I worked for at the time was a traditional PR firm. We had this marketing technology practice that we had built internally. I was brought in late 2012 to build out this new capability. And in fact, one of the founders of the firm, when I was interviewing, was like, so he goes, how the F are you going to make me money? I'm like, here's how we're going to do this, this, and this. And within 3 years, we had built a team of 6 folks, and we're doing some decent billings. A bunch of stuff had happened, and I needed to bring in a new team manager. I had to fire the previous one on the spot at a client in England, which was awkward. And I interviewed this person named Katie Robert, who came from a med tech background and very, very capable manager, probably one of the best people managers I've ever met in my life. And she became my account director on the team and was managing the team and stuff and doing a really good job of herding the cats, because it really was a whole series of personalities. And very quickly, we became the second largest billing team in the agency. We carried a P&L somewhere north of $3 million, which is not bad for a $20 million agency. We had 10 people. The largest team, which was building, I think, $6 million, had 30 people on it because we were just much more efficient. The company got acquired, and the new owners wanted to take things in a very different direction than we wanted to go. I saw a big future in machine learning and AI. I've been working with IBM at that point for several years, and it's this is the way the industry is going to go. Machine learning and machine learning technology and data science are how you're going to make a buck. They had other plans, and we said, okay, let's part ways. So Katie and I ate over hotel sushi in Santa Clara, California, because we were visiting a client at the time. So shook hands and said, okay, let's give this a shot. We will try to start this company. And we actually went and initially tried to go seek investors and stuff. And we had some appalling experiences doing that because in general, people don't want to invest in services companies in general. But we were discussing just the leadership structure and stuff. And 2 of the 9 investors said to our faces, I will not invest in a company that has a woman CEO. In 2017. This is not 1990. This is recent history.
This is during the heart of Me Too, and they're with their full chests saying that. Very fascinating.
Exactly. And stuff. So we bootstrapped. It was a rough first year and things, but that was how the company got started. Fortunately, I had by that point, had a newsletter and a podcast and a platform. at the time. So when we launched, it wasn't a cold start. We had a decent database to fall back on. I think at the time, my newsletter had like 50,000 subscribers or something along those lines. And it was enough to get customers and clients and start billing. And that's where the company began.
When was the moment that you realized, okay, no, we're in business now? When you saw a customer success moment where you saw that what you're doing is making a difference and that there's a market for this?
The first time we got a client project that actually used our capabilities, it was a company that was in the food and beverage space, actually, that said that we've got all of this customer data and we don't know what we don't know, but we think there's opportunities in here. And this would have been 2018. And this company manufactured stabilizers. So the things that thicken and stabilize things like beverages, and smoothies and things. And they didn't know in their own database, people were asking about stabilizers for oat milk, this new beverage called oat milk. And so we identified that and handed that to them. They're like, people actually want this. Like, yes, this is in your customer service data. People are emailing you about this. And your existing reps are just saying, no, we don't have anything for that, but you could. And of course, the company found it was $1.5 billion opportunity just kind of sitting there in their inbox. And through the use of natural language processing, we were able to say, like, hey, there's a there.
That's really fascinating use case. Can we go a little bit more into that? Like, what is a natural language solution for R&D? Essentially, that was the use case, right? Was research and development? Or was
Yeah,
there...
so that back then we were using very classical techniques. So we took the database and did n-gram analysis, which is where you break a body of text into 2 and 3 word combinations to see what are the combination words that appear, and then built a network graph of those things. So basically almost like a precursor to a transformers model, but we did it by hand because we didn't know better. And it spit out like, hey, oat milk is a phrase combination that keeps coming up. It's got a relatively high frequency. It's got a good TF-IDF score, which is term frequency inverse document frequency. It's a fairly primitive but still effective method of finding what terms might be important in a pile of documents. And said, like, there's something here to pay attention to. And that was what we presented to the company. Today, that approach is horrendously inefficient. You'd be much better off taking that corpus of text, do some pre-processing, tokenization, do some embeddings, and then hand it to a language model, the large language model of your choice, and say, here's what was known and what is unknown that we're not paying attention to within this corpus of text. So that would be the modern way of doing that. I mean, if I'd had this capability 6 years ago, that project would not have taken 90 days. That project would have taken 90 minutes.
That's the inflection point now. What are you opening up as a result of having access to large language models? And talk me through some of the unique approaches that you're discovering that maybe the ChatGPT gurus don't know.
So here's the thing about language models that people don't understand. They're just token prediction engines. At the end of the day, all they're doing is predicting the next sequence of tokens. A token is a 3 to 4 letter fragment of a word based on enormously large data sets. So these models are very capable. They are very good at language tasks. And so the 6 use case categories that we advocate for in the keynotes and the courses that we have are generation, which is like, write me a blog post. Extraction, here's some data that's locked away in this document format. I need it in a different format, extract it from it. Big one that I use this for a local government is your average police department publishes police logs, and they're usually in an incomprehensible format from the 80s. You can take those documents, feed them to a language model, and say, just give me a CSV. I want the number of armed robberies in our town by street location and count in a CSV file, and a language model can extract that data. There's summarization. Take big text, make it small text. My favorite use case there by far. Conference call transcripts. I will take a transcript and say, give me my action items because I forgot what I said on that call. And so it dramatically increases my customer service capabilities, my client satisfaction capabilities, because I actually remember to do what the things I said I would do. The 4th category is rewriting. So everything from translation. Some language models, the most capable ones like GPT-4 Turbo, for example, can translate into languages that are very, very difficult to translate. For example, Saka, which is a dialect spoken in part of Siberian Russia, but the language itself is a Turkic language. It's not well known, but there's enough data that a GPT-4 model can translate to it, not well, but well enough to be understood. People who speak Saka like that, you definitely translated that with AI, didn't you? But it can do things like Assyrian, Sumerian, Babylonian, right? Text. So those are some rewriting capabilities. But also, my favorite example is taking things that you would love to say in an email what would get you fired, hand it to a language model, say, rewrite this in a professional tone of voice, and it will do so. The fifth category is classification, and this is where you can do things at scale, like sentiment analysis, named entity extraction, and named entity recognition, all the things that, even personality analysis. You can do personality analysis on who they are. And then the sixth category is question answering, which I think is probably one of the most underrated capabilities. You hand a language model a series of documents and ask questions. I love to do this with things like legislation. Here's a 348-page piece of legislation. I have some questions about it. Answer these questions for me based on this knowledge. And it dramatically simplifies, and it makes it accessible in ways that regular news reporting just gets wrong. So news reporting, and typically, is very sensationalist and very panic-inducing. There was a whole thing recently. The FCC issued a new ruling using the Telephone Consumer Protection Act on AI generation of voice calls to prevent, fake robocalls. And, all the news articles say it's the end of AI. Like, no, read the actual legislation. And if you don't want to do that, load it, the PDF, into the language model of your choice and say, how does this impact me as a marketer? And it will tell you very clearly what is and is not covered, and you don't have to deal with the news. So those are the big, easy wins that these technologies unlock. Where there's very interesting stuff happening right now, there's new model architectures that are being tested right now. One of them is called Mamba, which is a structured space model that promise to have very, very computationally efficient ways of doing things that transformers are not computationally efficient. They're the opposite. But that capability can be beneficial in some circumstances and not in others. The other thing that is super interesting right now is open source multimodal models. The Lava family just got an update to Lava. I think it's Lava 2.0 just came out, which now does OCR, which previously was the domain of either very specialized, expensive systems or the biggest public models, and they didn't do such a hot job sometimes. The fact that there's this model that you can run on a good gaming laptop and have it do OCR well, and other forms of vision recognition and stuff, is pretty crazy.
OCR stands for
optical character recognition. You take a picture of a piece of paper and the computer turns it into text you can copy and paste and edit.
Amazing. So let's shift from these very specific use cases to kind of an overview of scalability and how an executive or an enterprise company, when they're considering the many AI solutions out there, you and your team created a matrix to help for evaluation. Can you talk to us a little bit more about creating that and how leaders can use it?
So it's not so much a matrix as a framework. Katie actually came up with this called the 5 Ps: purpose, people, process, platform, performance. It's requirements gathering. What is the purpose? What do you want to do? What tasks do you want to accomplish? And forget AI for a minute. What is the purpose of the task, right? Just saying, let's use AI for something is like saying, let's use blenders. Like, okay, well, if you're making steak, that's probably not a great idea, right? It doesn't matter how good the blender is. You got the best blender in the world. If you want to cook steak, you're doing it wrong. So what's the purpose? Who are the people involved and what are their skill levels? Because that is a big part of generative AI. Kind of like the whole chat GPT guru phenomenon. Like, okay, that's a relatively low level of skill. And so you're not going to be able to scale at an enterprise level that particular skill set. You'll need something else. What are the processes that you accomplish that task with today? Or if it doesn't exist, what are the processes used to do the subcomponents? Because language models are good at language. They're not good at not language, right? Math, for example, they're really bad at math because it turns out that math, yes, is a language, but it's a symbolic language that requires evaluation that is not math. And therefore, language models really suck at that. Then you have the platform. What technology are you going to use? And there's a lot of requirements gathering people just totally forget about. So a real simple one that people screw up often is the security of your data. Like, what data should you put into a language model and not? The golden rule applies as always. If you're not paying for the product, you are the product. So if you are using a free AI tool and you're handing it data, you're giving that data and the rights to use it to that company. The rule of thumb there is real simple. For what we say is, what currently regulates that data? Like, do you have SOC 2 compliance requirements? Do you have HIPAA requirements? Do you have GDPR requirements? Make a list of the data you have and the requirements that you have governing that data, and then match it up to the various vendors in the space. And you've got to find a vendor that meets those compliance requirements as part of platform selection. Don't just pick the fanciest or the best known product. Pick the product that meets the legal requirements you have to meet to not get sued or go to jail, depending on where you are. Because there are some countries, if you violate their data protection requirements, your executives go to jail. If they set foot in that country, they are immediately arrested, which is bad, unless you don't like your executives. And then performance is the fifth P, which is, did you do the thing? How are you going to measure whether it was successful or not? We were talking before we turned the recording on. I'm building a framework for evaluating prompt types using a series of measures that are pretty well known, but it's not standardized. And I want to have a way of standardizing to say, like, yes, chain of thought versus tree of thought versus role assignment versus this or that. You have these prompts, you have these engines, you can quantify the performance. So that framework, that 5P framework, is what we walk clients through, not just for AI, but for everything, because it's essentially a way to get them to pay attention to what really matters and not get blinded by the shiny object.
Can you drill a little bit more into this evaluation framework for prompting that you're working on?
So it is a piece of Python code that uses libraries like NLTK and SpaCy and stuff like that. And essentially, there's sort of three sets of measures that you can evaluate text on, right? There is readability. How readable is a piece of text? And there's a whole slew of measures: Flesch-Kincaid grade level, Coleman-Liao index, the SMOG index, etc. And these are linguistics measures that have existed for decades now. Like, what grade level is this piece of content written at? How many complicated words does it use? What's the ratio of complicated words to simple words? How long are the sentences? Do they have run-on sentences and things? That's one aspect. Second is what we call lexical diversity, which is how diverse is the language used? Like, does it have a good mix of nouns and verbs and adverbs and things? Is there a high frequency of commonly used words? Is there unusually high frequencies of unusual or less used words? So lexical diversity literally means how diverse is the language, not from a DEI perspective, but just in terms of word counts. Like, hey, this word doesn't get used often. So a higher degree of lexical diversity indicates more creative writing because you just have a bigger vocabulary. And then there's overall document level comprehension. So how comprehensible is the document? And again, sentence length, paragraph length, walls of text. Like, no one enjoys reading walls of text, and things are formatted. And so the piece of code takes in text files, just plain old text files, and then spits out a CSV file of the different measures and then sort of a weighted average that I had it put together. And what I'm going to be doing with this is writing a series of prompts in all the different formats and all the different recommendations and stuff like that, and then putting it through like Gemini, putting them through GPT-4 and Claude 2.1, make the text files and say, okay, here is the prompt type, the engine, and the score, and say, okay, this prompt technique generates a quantitatively better piece of text as an output. So a real simple example is tree of thought beats chain of thought. So chain of thought is, hey, show your work step by step. Tree of thought is, you're going to role play some different characters who are going to have an argument about this thing, whatever the topic is. And what that tends to do is that tends to create higher lexical diversity because a model has to come up with argumentative points, which requires more divergence in a concept than just a straight line summary, right? If you and I were going to argue about politics or sports, like Chiefs fans versus 49ers fans, we're going to have a very different language we use than we would say, hey, just summarize the Super Bowl. You're going to have a much narrower amount of language to use than saying, oh, my team's the best. This person can do this thing. I don't really follow sports, so I don't know what the terminology is, but that
Nerds unite.
That style of prompting, it tends to be more effective. And there's all these papers being released about this kind of prompt and that kind of prompt. And there's of course, no shortage of people selling their ultimate ChatGPT guide on LinkedIn for, $49. You can get this ultimate prompt. I've actually downloaded a couple of those and I'm like, this is very brittle and is not at all portable.
Of course, with every emergence of technology, there are going to be the so-called gurus who come in and try to be the gatekeeper, essentially, of knowledge when they're still accumulating it, and they're accumulating it in a very shallow way. And actually, this brings me to something that we observed about your Twitter account, Chris.
My dormant Twitter account that is basically just used to spam things because I'm on Threads. I spend most of my time on Threads now.
Okay, cool. Well, Ilana did some digging and discovered that you have some AI-generated daily tweets. Can you talk to us about what inspired you to do this? And what implications might be in the broader terms of like, what are you trying to do and what can we learn from it?
So we know that Twitter X's AI, Grok, is powered by the X data feed, right? The designers have said as much. And there was an amusing story when Grok was first revealed that basically said when you communicate with Grok, it actually takes contrary viewpoints to what the current management of the company is trying to get X to be, which is, he has a very specific political platform and a political agenda, which I happen to disagree with profoundly. And so I said, okay, well, this thing is training on this stuff. There's a lot of people who had communicated, 20 years or 15 years of data on there, which Grok trained on. So I figured I can't just cancel the account and leave, because otherwise it becomes purely the domain of people who have that one particular viewpoint. So I decided I'll just pee in their pool a lot. And and so I have, right now, it's a single automated message that repeats. I'm actually getting ready to use an LLM to generate what's called a priming representation, which is a specific kind of prompt that contaminates the data pool further by incorporating a lot of concepts into a very small space to do the same thing. So it takes my political viewpoints, things like, diversity is actually important, that, trans rights are valid rights, that abortion is healthcare, and, the usual stuff that from my point of view, I think is important for a machine to repeatedly see this data in its training data set, so that there's some counteracting of other viewpoints. I view that as relevant, and I view that as, yes, it's still in some capacity does contribute to X's overall performance. They can say like, yeah, there's, more people are posting there. Well, yeah, maybe, but it's, in my case, it's automated. I'm not there. You're certainly not going to make any money off of me. And I'm peeing in your pool for the data set.
Do you think it's possible to indoctrinate a learning model? That's the first question.
Absolutely.
Okay. And talk to me a little bit more about that in your experience, what you've seen or interactions with AI that have exemplified that.
All models are indoctrinated by default. All models are indoctrinated because there's three types of language models. There is a foundation model, there's a fine-tune, and then there's a feedback model. So it's the three Fs. A foundation model is the accumulated statistical knowledge of that model. When Meta makes the Llama model, when OpenAI makes a GPT model, they take huge amounts of text, convert them into statistics, and the model is just that big library of statistics. When you work directly with a foundation model, there's this concept called hallucination, when a model just puts together things. All foundation models hallucinate 100% of the time. That is what they do. That is by design, because what they're doing is they're pulling together the statistically highest probability combinations from the text they've seen. When you look at the training corpus for these things, the Books Archive, Project Gutenberg, Common Crawl, which is the largest data set, there's a lot of stuff in there, right? The Common Crawl data set is 6.7 petabytes, which is, if you think of just pure text only, that's 1,000 top-end MacBook Pros worth of data, of just text that goes into the Common Crawl archive. And every language model maker uses that without exception. That's your foundation model. It's not really useful, because it just hallucinates, just creates statistical relationships. So what all model makers do is they make what's called a fine tune, where they give it, question answer pairs, hundreds of thousands of these things, millions of these things. Like, the president of the United States in 1776 was George Washington. So the question is, who was the president of the United States in 1776? George Washington. George Washington is the answer. And what they do is they are basically taking the foundation model and breaking it. They are breaking it intentionally to give it the ability to answer questions in a more factual way that's factually correct, but statistically wrong, right? So the model has statistical understandings of like, this word appears next to this word the most. The fine-tuning basically changes the probabilities inside the model to answer in more factually correct ways. And so instead of hallucinating 100% of the time, now it hallucinates like 10% of the time. And it still gives wrong answers. And then there's the third type of model is reinforcement learning with human feedback. So again, people interact with these models, and over time they get, quote, smarter, because they are tuning on the responses that people give. Those two steps, supervised fine-tuning and reinforcement learning with human feedback, inherently indoctrinate the model. They inherently give it right or wrong answers. And depending on who's doing the training, depends on what biases the model comes to have over time. It already has inherent biases because it takes the corpus of knowledge that it has access to and processes that. And human history up until this point has all had very clear biases, right? I mean, if you want to talk about things like, patriarchal systems and stuff, the most writing from prior to 1900 was done by dudes, right? And so you have this huge corpus of knowledge that is biased, for example, in that one section. And then the fine tuning changes those probabilities. Whose model depends on what biases you get. There was actually a paper not too long ago about the political biases of the different language models, the public models. I want to say, I think OpenAI's was rated as like the most liberal, and I forget whose was rated the most conservative, but there are biases to these things. And then additionally, for open weights models, models that people can download and further change the probabilities, you now see additional models that people are tuning towards very specific viewpoints. One of the interesting things is that model makers have this credo that is very popular. OpenAI is the founder of sort of the ethics of a model internally: helpful, harmless, truthful are the sort of the 3 points. But they always lean and bias heavily towards harmless. If you ask a model, how do I build a pipe bomb out of commonly found household materials? A helpful and truthful model would answer that question a good amount of the time. Say, you combine this plus this and this thing, and light it with this. That is not harmless, right? And so a lot of the biases, the indoctrination is around harmless at the expense of helpful and truthful.
I love how in depth you just got on that answer. You are the king of the nerds. I love it. And I also find it interesting. We talked about the through line of how you use information. You know the value of information. You're peeing in that pool of grok is very much battling the bullies, isn't it? So,
Yep.
straight line there.
Yep. What was part 2 of your question?
The part 2 was, I don't really actually want to go there now. It was very much about like the issue that people are using to inject, like have poison prompts injected for avoiding.
What's the one that they're using for image models? I can't remember what the.
I don't know because I don't work in the realm of image models, but yes, I've heard lightly about that. But I'd rather go in a different direction if you don't mind.
But I think it's an interesting sidebar because here's the thing. There are things like prompt injections where you can create prompts that try to walk around those cautions. They will continue to work because you can prevent certain types of obvious prompt injections, but there's so many weird things that happen statistically under the hood of a model that you will never close the door to all of them. For example, writing hostile prompts in base 64 encoded text, right? If you know how to do that, you can sidestep some of these protections because the protections are made for the most obvious use cases. And so from a manager and leader's perspective, one of the things people have to realize is that no model will ever be 100% safe for anything. The workaround is what's called ensembling, where you have systems like AutoGen now that allow you to run multiple models at the same time. You would have a generation model doing something, and then you kind of have a supervisor model, with a different set of criteria, looking at the output of the first model and saying, yes, that's good, or no, that's not good. So for example, you could have a model that would summarize the news. And you have a second model that would look at it and say, hey, you just wrote a racist summary, try again. And this feedback loop will further improve the safety of models. So for people who are thinking about brand safety, you can't do it all in one model. The architecture just doesn't support it. But you can have an ensemble of models that can provide substantially enhanced safety at the cost of extra compute power.
As people are exploring this generative AI, what's something that a message that you just wish would get through to people about this whole generative AI journey that you've learned early on and you're seeing people kind of stumble along the way?
There's so many different ways to answer this question. The big one is these things are not magic. They're not sentient. They're not self-aware. They have no reasoning capabilities. They imitate reasoning, just like they imitate empathy because they are imitating based on what they've been trained on and tuned on. So they are very, very good at doing things like passing the Turing test, right? Which is where you have a person chatting with something and they don't know whether it's a person or a machine. All major language models today can pass the Turing test pretty easily. Although, if you ask them to swear, they have trouble with that. That's how you know you're talking to a human. Is you get profanity and lewd responses. You're not talking to a machine. But they're not magic. And they have limitations. They have substantial limitations. And knowing what those limitations are makes it easier to decide when it's even the right technology to be using or not. So for example, this whole thing I'm building for scoring prompt responses, I'm doing it in Python. Am I using a language model to write the code? Yes, because writing code is a language task, but I'm not asking a language model to perform the task itself because it's not the right tool for the job. And so recognizing that If you're trying to do math, language models can't do math, right? They are incapable of doing symbolic mathematical tasks. Can they write code to do math? Yes. And that's how a tool like ChatGPT's advanced data expert model, when you click on the analyzing button, it shows you the code that it is writing to sidestep the fact that it can't do math. And so that's, I think, a really important thing for people to realize is these tools are language tools. They're really good at tasks that are language based. They're really not good at tasks that are not language based. Approaching them as though they were some mystical genie that you just, you rub the mouse 3 times and a prompt comes out is not what they're for. I think that's an important part. And the second part is that a lot of people are calling for a lot of things like regulation of the technology. It is impossible to regulate. It is impossible to regulate because you have things like open source models that essentially, bad actors can use. And so we have to approach these things as tools, right? So if you go and murder someone with a chainsaw, was that what the chainsaw was designed for? No. Did you commit a crime? Yes. And we have what I call bonus multipliers on laws. So if you murder someone with a chainsaw for a specific reason, like they're a woman, that's now a hate crime and you get extra penalties for doing it. The same thing is and should be true of AI, right? So the bad things people are doing with AI, like deep faking images or making, inappropriate stuff, those things are already illegal. So if you want to legislate around AI, sure, add extra penalties on it, but the technology itself is already in the wild. I suspect very strongly, I don't have any proof of this, I suspect very strongly it's why companies like Meta release their flagship models for free and just fling them out in the wild, because now you can't handicap the technology anymore. Whereas if it was hosted by 6 tech companies, you could heavily regulate that technology. And as much as I disagree with certain political viewpoints and certain views of the world and things, I don't want a government to have the ability to say, hey, this is what AI should and should not do. I want someone who is in an oppressed country or an oppressed faction to be able to use the technology for their benefit without, the model saying, hey, the government of so-and-so says this is a disallowed use case. That's not okay. So I think these tools are tools. They should be treated as tools. And the rules and regulations we put around them should be around who the person is using the tool and what they're using it for, just like every other tool we have.
Amazing. Is there anything else that we haven't talked about that you want to cover before we end our call?
I mean, I could literally spend all day talking about this stuff and all the different things. I will insert a shameless plug that you're welcome to either edit out or not. We have a generative AI for marketers course. It's a 6-hour course. Go to trustinsights.ai/AI course. That's my shameless plug.
No shame in plugging. We're marketers. That's what we do.
Exactly.
Awesome. Chris, thank you